Well, here we are. It's the ultimate podcast episode for November. Yep, on the ledge. Dave Trafford here with Keith Leslie and John Wright, also joined by Sabrina Nanji, who is the founder, the editor at Queen's Park Observer. And I think we really need to start with the biggest scandal the province has seen, probably, I can't imagine how long it's been. This one ranks right up there, though, and that is what the hell's going on in Wiarton. Wiarton Willie apparently is no more, and that's not the scandal in and of itself. Keith Leslie, we understand now that there was a cover-up.
Cover-up.
The death of the groundhog happened before Groundhog Day 2021.
This is a massive conspiracy.
Really, and then we all cheered for a fur hat on February the 2nd, 2021.
First of all,
how do we get to the bottom of this?
We all didn't cheer. I can assure you most of the reporters assigned there weren't cheering, because I've assigned a few myself over the years, and they never said thanks. But yeah, of all the silliness to hit, it just raises so many questions, doesn't it? Like, why would you lie to us? Just get another damn rodent, put your fur hat on it if you need to, but for God's sakes, what kind of, is going to ding tourism? Well, does it really draw a lot of tourists? It draws some media cameras, and a whole bunch of locals come out on a cold day, and it's a good fun thing. But don't blow it up into something it's not. It's not your tourism center for the year. Although I guess it does draw some, but for goodness sakes, covering it up, I don't know what to say other than you have to run for re-election, and that never helps.
Well, now, John, we're in a situation where we have to almost have a television show for the search for the new Willie, because the finding.
I'm sorry.
Finding a white albino groundhog apparently is a challenge. So, we need to do an international search now.
I don't know. It just reinforces this whole idea of fake news. I mean, the news media knew about this. Keith, your tribe knew about this, and what they did, they buried their head in the sand. There, I just leave it at that. I mean, they just went down a hole that they couldn't get out of, right?
Well, I confessed this morning on the radio station, on John Moore's show, that if they're really in search of a new rodent, we have Don Valley Dick here that we could offer them up, because there's plenty of them running around here in Don Mills in Toronto. So
those are possums, man.
Can't we have like hamsters or something? There's a lot of those. I mean.
Well, I think you got to be authentic. Sabrina, I don't know if you've ever had to cover Wiarton Willie in person. I do recall, though, back in 1999, the scandal when Willie died shortly before Groundhog Day, and they brought out the corpse. And it was the guy who broke the news was Taylor Parnaby.
No, I've never had the pleasure of covering a groundhog.
Oh, come on! If you're Queen's Park Observer, you got to pick up your game here a little bit. I'm thinking.
Now it's high on my list. I'll be there February 2nd. Whatever rodent is predicting the weather. I mean, I guess Keith, you're probably rooting for Shubenactady Sam now too.
Absolutely.
The weather competition over there.
It used to be, as I say, when I did assignment editing, it was my favorite thing to assign out. And I'll just leave it at that.
It's a fun event. My thing is that if they found another white groundhog, we would have never known about this. That's the thing I can't get over with this whole debacle.
The cover up is always the worst part, right?
I don't know. Ignorance is bliss. Okay.
Yeah. Just curious, who is Willie's member up there?
Stop it.
Bill Walker. New deputy speaker.
Stop it.
He's going to introduce Finding Willie legislation, right? And it's okay. We'll go.
There we go.
We need some accountability. Yeah.
It's a small act.
We sure do. All right. I'm glad we got that off our chests. Because, otherwise, we're talking about polling numbers, the latest details, and Ontarians' approaches and attitudes towards what's going on at the park. John, you've got fresh ink on that. Yeah,
we're leading into the election year. Obviously, if we find a rodent who can predict that, It would be great to know. What the polling that was just put out showed that 50% of the people believe that the government is on the right track, as opposed to 50% who believe it's in the wrong direction. But these are all very atmospheric things. They're not about the vote. We're watching at the vote aggregation nowadays that show plurality as opposed to a majority. But there's some very simple numbers here. 37% to 38% in that range gets you a majority government. So you always want to kind of be above that number. So if your approval ratings as premier are between 42 and 45, which they would be for this premier at the moment, then those are good numbers because it's above the 37 or 38. When you get right track, wrong track at 50%, those are really good numbers because it shows that if you look at these kind of numbers versus the actual vote, it's a little bit like taking a shot with a 3-iron into a good wind. Like it kind of brings it back to where the 40 may be. So it kind of goes forward, blows back, and you get closer to the pin. The numbers are okay. I would say that the times that they were the worst in this government were not just in the first year when Dean French was managing it from the corner office, but the last time it was worse like this was last March. If we remember the pandemic pandemonium where the premier had to go underground like Wiarton Willie for a while, and we didn't see it from him for a month. That was the worst, so they've clearly recovered. I think what it means for the opposition party is that campaigning is really going to matter. This time out, they're going to have to define that issue. I don't think there is an issue yet defined for the government, but the government's going to do everything it can to define the issue for its advantage. But I think the atmospherics simply say to me is that they've recovered from where they were, 8 months ago. But now we're about to get into January, which will be the slide towards the election. And that is going to be the time when we see, the real sharpness of what the ballot question is going to be.
A couple things I want to touch on, including the rollout for vaccines for the kids. But just speaking of sort of the agenda heading into the election, there was a lot of noise on the weekend, Sabrina, about the feds and the province finally sitting down for the first time this week to talk about the childcare plan. It's gone kind of quiet. What are you hearing?
Yeah, it's crickets, which I guess is, not a sign. I guess it could go either way, but I think we have been hearing at least the Ford government getting hammered by the opposition critics on that issue this week. We had heard, just on the eve of these talks between Ottawa and Ontario, I think they met over 2 days, Wednesday, Thursday earlier this week, and that Ottawa was still waiting on these numbers from the province, these detailed cost projections. The education minister, Stephen Lecce, actually, happy birthday today, on Friday, the 26th. He's actually promised this modeling that's going to show this $10.2 billion is just not enough for Ontario to get to $10 a day childcare. So, on the eve of these talks, those numbers hadn't been presented, but I did hear that, something was shown to Ottawa. Whether or not Ottawa thinks that's adequate, I guess will remain to be seen. But no details, no really word on if we're going to get a deal. But we know that this is obviously something the Ford government's going to want to announce, especially as we're talking about the election coming up around the corner. And I think the sooner the better for them.
Keith, is this one of those situations where the numbers are so crazy that the Ford government risks the public losing track of what's going on here? It's more or less just get a deal done. Quit fussing around the edges on this stuff, because the longer they delay it, I would think the least advantage that they have in coming up with a deal that they want.
I'm not sure. I don't know what their strategy is on this, whether a delay is good for them. I think in the end they want to certainly plan out the timing of the announcement to roll into their election campaign. They want to take all the credit, and they're going to want to take credit for having struck a better deal than any other province has struck because of Ontario's unique circumstances and all we're already spending on pre-K and blah, 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 blah. So they're not telling us. I think crickets is probably good news for the prospects of an actual deal, but it sounds to me still like they are way, way, way far apart on the dollars to get to something that would be close to $10 a day daycare in Ontario. That would take a huge, huge amount of money. We know the cost, what parents are paying in Southern Ontario and in the GTA in particular. How you get that down to $10 a day? That's going to take a massive amount of money. And I think it is different than what the deal would be with other provinces. It has to be economically, financially. It just has to be. So I don't know how close they can be in this, but I would read that the silence from both sides, because Ottawa in particular was leaking a lot on this. The silence, I think, bodes well for the prospects of them actually hammering out a deal.
Yeah, I guess, Sabrina, the other side of this is they can both play it politically as they see fit vis-a-vis the feds and the province. But at some point, to Keith's point, where we begin to look at what's unique, say, about Ontario, I think you're going to hear a lot of people still ask around, well, why is it that somebody who's making this amount of money is getting $10 a day daycare or childcare, as opposed to the single mom who really needs it as an element to get out to work? We're going to start to get down in the granular weeds on this stuff, and I don't think we're too far from either talking about a means test around this, which I think most people would say, okay, let's have the conversation. But as soon as the Ford government drops that out there, well, you're only having it for people who, and you begin to throw up roadblocks, it becomes a criticism. But I'm hearing a lot of that sort of anecdotally on the fringes, where people are saying, well, you know what, if it means $10 a day for somebody else, that's fine. I don't need that subsidy.
Yeah, and no, that's a good point. And I do think that, the Ford government could kind of play that to their favor. I mean, just generally speaking, conservative governments aren't looked at as so compassionate as maybe others, let's say. And if the Ford government said that, we should do a means test or even provided data, oh my gosh, a reporter's dream for that would be great. But, it'd also buy them more time, politically speaking, which maybe they need as well. So I think on that front, that remains to be seen. But we are hearing a lot of that stuff coming on other issues these days too. Like we had the electric rebate for electric vehicle rebates that were announced by Stephen Del Duca, promising if he becomes premier, and the PCs immediately flipping that to be, well, this is going to, favor the rich, a tax credit for millionaires who can afford these cars. Obviously the Liberals take issue with that, but they kind of turn that around and say that's really what the staycation tax credit that the PCs are offering is doing, that, you need to spend $1,000 or what have you on a vacation in order to get this credit. Not everyone can do that. So I think, this is just a bit of a precursor to show that pocketbook issues and folks that maybe left behind by some of these policies not getting captured in them, they're going to play a bigger role, or at least we're going to hear more about them from the political parties. And I think it's significant for the Ford government to jump on those kinds of things. So,
John, when we took to Sabrina's point about the pocketbook issues, and I was paying attention particularly more so to maybe the electric vehicle discussion than I would have normally, only because we in our house are in the place on our calendar where our leases are coming up. Mm-hmm. So we're thinking, okay, let's make sure that we're in enough time, because supply chain and all that kind of stuff. So our leases aren't up until late spring, but we're already getting the phone calls and the emails from the dealers. And so as we were doing our research, and I'm thinking, okay, with all the conversation around going carbon zero, by in the next 30 years, if I go out and buy a gasoline driven vehicle right now, and it's a 5-year lease, the diminished return on that, my buyback on it is going to be different than it would be if it were an electric vehicle, because we're going to get to a point sooner than later where we not only stop making them, they're not going to have any market value. So in this conversation around the e-car and the e-vehicle subsidies, nobody's talking about it from the manufacturing perspective, which surprises me a little bit, because that's really where the heart of this is going to catch fire. I'm going to either buy and sell because I have more value in an e-vehicle down the road in terms of trade-in value than I would if it's a gasoline-driven vehicle. So there, to me, is the value, the longer term, the longer view in all of this, and how a subsidy might be able to help the manufacturing of that and make sure that I'm educated enough when I'm buying or leasing a vehicle at this point.
I suppose there are a lot of vehicles who have sat in the driveway for the last 2 years that, like myself with a little Buick, that has virtually no kilometers on it. If I come to the end of my lease, I might as well just buy the damn thing because I'll make a ton of money off of it if I sell it even the next day. I mean, there's no mileage on it because of COVID, like none.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I guess that's the issue that I face. I guess to the point on the electric vehicles, I don't know why the Tory government has backed themselves so far into a corner on this issue of, if you go out and get an electric vehicle, or I guess hybrids would be the same, that you're suddenly a millionaire. I mean, maybe that's because if you own your own home in this province, you are automatically a millionaire. But I don't see how, if you want to help climate change in the future, that we don't revert over there. And the more that those are made, the more out in Oshawa that are made, the more that people get into them, the more jobs that are created, the incentives are more for people to switch over to those things. I go back to your point about the means test. I mean, I saw so many conservative supporters on Twitter this week attack people who were simply saying that it would be good to be able to buy an electric car. Like that phrase was, you're a millionaire. Like it just over and over and over again. And it just seems to have backed themselves into a corner. Well, what's the alternative? A gas-powered machine, to your point. So I think the sentiment is such that if you could buy an electric car, you would. Not everybody can. But more to the point, as we get into January, if the Bank of Canada begins to raise rates, if in fact the bread and butter issues become more prominent, then these issues of the cars and other things kind of fade away into the background, and it becomes more accented by the day-to-day issues that we face. So yes, one of them will be gas and the price of gas, but more importantly, these big ticket items that people are going to be buying, I think actually most people will postpone buying cars in the spring, and that's not going to be much of an incentive to get anything that's electric or gas otherwise.
I would be more inclined to buy an electric vehicle if the government hadn't gone along and ripped out public infrastructure like charging stations at GO stations. This really does not give me confidence that now they want to turn green and say we're going to build all the EV batteries here in Ontario. No rebates, though, as you say, they're for the millionaires. Well, we know that even Tesla has a car that's, reasonably priced compared to a lot of other things on the market. And with the rebates, if they get the $8,000 and blah, 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 quite reasonable overall. But again, I don't have a government that believes in this, really. They're looking to get jobs out of it, but they're not looking to provide the public infrastructure. And until there's some serious infrastructure, people are not going to be able to use these cars to commute. You just can't. I mean, you can commute a short distance, Burlington to Toronto perhaps, but what if it's one of those days where you spend 3 hours waiting for that accident to clear? It's cold. Your charge is gone. You can't have the radio on. You can't have the heater. All these issues. We need public infrastructure, and we just don't have it. So as much as our goals on EVs are laudable, I think the reality of most people is that it's just not there. That decision can't be made realistically yet unless it's a second or third vehicle for a family, in which case, check your privilege.
Just on the whole issue of congestion this week, I guess the 413 keeps coming up and biting the Ford team in the rear end. I think it was at the Star this week, Sabrina, that had the story suggesting that their own research found out that this was not going to be a solution to congestion. It was just going to make it more intense and spread it out across the region. We've been saying earlier in the podcast, there are other ways of doing this. Building highways is one thing, but we have no view, I don't think, or vision to traffic management. And that's really what we need to be paying attention to, as much and all as we're focused on paving over, part of the region.
Yeah, not a good story for the Ford government. And somehow I just have a feeling that it's not going to be the only one with this particular highway, the 413 coming up. And I have to say, I really just, I hope the Auditor General looks into this. Like, she obviously has access to documents that the public or reporters don't really have ready access to. And I know the opposition parties have asked her to look into the cost of the 413 and the Bradford bypass, because they're such a big part of the Ford government's re-election platform. And, obviously now with the Star report from Ben Spur, there's questions about, what they're saying about the traffic and timing. I mean, we had the premier just kind of standing up there with no backing saying this is going to save you 30 minutes. We had that report that was public from, a while back saying that it's really more like 30 seconds. And now here's the government's own document saying that, it's really not going to do much to alleviate the gridlock. So there's so many questions around these projects. And the Ford government's just going to bulldoze ahead with it. I don't know if we're going to see, detailed costs of it in the future. But at the end of the day, I think you're right. Like, I don't know how much the public really cares about that. But I do think that they care if they're not, if this isn't going to alleviate traffic, that's a big thing on people's minds at the end of the day.
Have they issued an RFP on this project? Do you know? I haven't seen one.
No, I don't believe so yet. I think it's still early. I have to fact check myself on that one.
Yeah.
But no, I think they're still trying to, they do say, they want this to be an open process. That's kind of why we're not hearing the details of any of the costing of it yet. That's the line from the government. They want it to be, let the market dictate it all.
But you have to issue an RFP to actually come to some kind of focus
for sure. Yeah,
on this,
they'll
right?
have to lay out the parameters.
We'd have to have a plan.
I haven't seen that yet. Yeah,
you'd have to have an actual plan, maybe a route, those kind of things to issue an RFP, or else it's magical thinking, I guess, or wishful thinking, aspirational. But it's just not there yet. So I don't know.
That's what they said. It's the intent. They wanted to signal their intent to get this bill.
So what can the auditor look at? There's nothing for the auditor to look at because there's no there. Which I think is part of the problem with this thing. And in the end, we saw a series of environmental reports released from the Auditor General's office this week, 5, I think, of them at once. And the basic thing is it's a good time to be a developer in Ford Nation. Do not want to be a species at risk. That's just not a good place to be. You don't want to be in a long-term care home. You're not going to go. This government is not sticking to what it's saying. Everything it does is meant to look good, but there's no there, and Highway 413 is especially indicative of that.
Well, John, one of the things that I had fully expected this week to hear hue and cry about how poorly the rollout for vaccines for kids was managed, and it was, to use Sabrina's phrase, crickets, because it seemed as though it went off without many problems. And in fact, the good news was something like 70,000 appointments on the first day for kids who were between 11 and 5. So parents have taken up the call to action here. I think for all the fuss and worry, and I think you were one of the first ones to point this out early on when people were responding to, will you get a vaccine? You saw numbers looked a little soft, but now that we're into it, well, clearly we've got up to 90% people who've rolled up their sleeves, and at least for one dose in some parts of the province. So that first initial response to the rollout for vaccines for kids, I thought, well, okay, this is awesome. Let's get this going, and good on the government for at least having the day one go without what appered to be any hitches.
Yeah, and thank goodness for Coverup coming out. That's a big incentive all around.
It's made all the difference. One thing we did know, we learned from that situation is that John Tory is clearly not Coverup.
There you go, but Steve Paikin actually is.
He may well be.
I think there's a few things to reflect upon. First of all, we did see a hesitancy on the public's involvement with the vaccines until other people had a chance to get it. So there was kind of a standing back. And we saw that last December when we first started to get the vaccines. It was well into about the end of February before people actually came on board. So there's the kind of the guinea pigs who go out and get it, and everybody else, there's a good percentage, maybe 35 or 40% are standing back. Dave, I don't know the numbers on kids in this province. I don't know how many are little kids and would be getting these vaccines, but maybe 70,000 is indicative that we're going to be okay, but maybe not. Maybe there's a whole lot of other parents who are standing back doing exactly the same thing. The second thing is that I was very fortunate this week. I got a call from my doctor's office. They said that they had lots of appointments open for a booster shot. I just happened to qualify for one of those. But the fact that they said that there were lots of appointments open for those booster shots is another issue of concern, obviously, for older people because they're not getting that shot. So there's still some hesitancy for whatever reason to go ahead and do it. But the third thing that's concerning as we do this podcast this morning is that another variant is starting to show up. A variant which may, in fact, I was quick to look at it last night, that, it looks like it's coming out of South Africa. The real issue now is actually the one in Hong Kong, the case that's developed in Hong Kong, which appears to be, when you go to Hong Kong, you have to spend 2 weeks in a hotel. It would appear that there's been transmission from a room to somebody getting it. And that means that it's through the ventilation system. And we all knew that this was going to be an airborne thing. But what it does raise now is, are we going to be prepared so that something like this doesn't catch us flat-footed again? I don't know how long these things take to get here. Clearly, I'm not, there's people who are not sounding alarm bells yet, because they sort of say, well, we don't know whether, what's the how transmissible this is and what the impact may be, and we're going to have to see how it rolls out. But it does raise a point that Keith has often banged the drum about, and that is we have a long runway oftentimes to get ready for these things. And oftentimes it has caught us out flat-footed. Well, now we have the canary in the coal mine. We don't know whether or not, it's something we should be worried about. But the next question is, what happens if it's going to evade the injection that we get to try and thwart it? Are we back into long-term care again? Are we back into those issues, which is picking off people at the higher end? I think, we can put our guard down a little bit and say that we want to get back to being okay. But that's what I read last night and what I'm hearing this morning reminds me that we're not anywhere close to having this thing run its course. And even though we have vaccines available to kids now and older people, you better get it because you don't know what's around the corner.
Yeah, Keith, complacency sort of at the heart of this, and I think there's also the level of fatigue that we've all had with coping with, and that really lends itself to it. But I check out the text message board when I'm doing the radio show, and people will get on the board, and the anti-vaxxers are just insane on this thing. But they will get on there and say, well, geez, another variant? Oh, God, I can't, the government's just feeding us a line. And all it does is it kind of gets into this mindset because there's another variant out there. There's another version of this coronavirus out there that somehow science got it all wrong. They've been telling us all along that there are variants, and there are thousands of them, actually. Some of them are just more serious and dangerous than others, and this appears to be one of them. But my sense of all of this is, in a normal year, say even 2 years ago, we weren't talking about coronavirus when they already had hints that it was out there, right? In December 2019, they were starting to, this might be a little bit concerning. The degree to which this is part of the general lexicon and conversation, I think, actually makes us better prepared. We're more resilient than we know, I think, heading into what may be another wave with a new variant.
I think so. People are tired, fed up, bored with it all. As I said last week, if science worked the way I said it should work, this wouldn't happen. But these variants of concern, still think it's a good band name, are going to keep coming at us. And we have to be prepared for this sort of thing. And apparently the anti-vaxxers are going to keep coming at us. They're trying to take down Chapman's ice cream now. So everyone go out this weekend, for goodness sakes, buy some Chapman's. Because I tell you, that is a solid, good Canadian company, and they're doing the right thing all the way along. The anti-vaxxer message, I don't know. It's just scary at this point. And, of course, the fact that there are variants and that we need boosters and that everything's not as effective as we had hoped it would be just feeds into their narrative and keeps them going down that path. I think ultimately one of the good things out of this pandemic will be that a far larger majority of people are going to now realize there's a whole lot of fake news that they shouldn't digest, and they're going to be able to tell the difference now. They're going to have learned through this pandemic sites and places you can go to are things that are just, if it's too incredible off the top, it probably is unreal. And I think there's going to be a lot of better news consumers come out of this in the end, because people, what was the challenge of the anti-vaxxers? Educate yourself, do some research. And a lot of people did. And they realized you're going down the wrong rabbit hole. And I think, yes, the algorithms feed those rabbit holes and they send you down them. So you've got to learn to pull yourself out and check out some other sources on your own. And I think that may be an upside, a benefit of this pandemic. The anti-vaxxers, whatever their core numbers turn out to be, the hardcore ones, I don't know how we're ultimately going to deal with them other than just accept them as best we can and try and get alongside with them. We had a case down here at one of the universities. It turns out all the ones that were just supposed to be showing their 2 test results a week weren't showing the results to anybody, kept them private. For goodness sakes, if you're going to play this, you have to comply. We have to go along. If you don't get vaxxed, you at least have to show the test. So people are at the end of their ropes for this, but I think Everyone's here. We're going to get the booster shots. Most of us are going to get the vaccines. I think Ontario did blow a little bit on the rollout and not having parents be able to book multiple appointments on the same day, because a lot of parents have kids, more than one kid, between 5 and 11. And BC did this. What they did there, you just had to book one appointment and you could bring your whole brood with you and get them all vaxxed. How they kept track of the number of vaccines at that point, I don't know. But Ontario could have been a bit smoother on that. But if that's the one hiccup, that's pretty good for a massive rollout of a children's vaccine. So let's see how it goes from here. But Dave, to the point of what do we do with that this feeds into the narratives that the anti-vaxxers want to chew on, there's not much we can do about that, but just keep sticking to the faith and let them realize, gee, well, maybe the other 90% of people have done some research and do know what they're talking about.
Yeah. Interesting that I know John's numbers earlier, Sabrina showed that there's a certain tolerance for the possibility of restrictions on the economy if need be, and it gets bad again. But one of the numbers that I watched this week was interesting to me, and I think has gone underreported. We look at the provincial number of cases on a daily basis, and there are the 650, 700 on day-to-day over the last little while. In the GTA, the numbers are around 200. It's the most densely populated part of the province and only has a third, give or take, of the cases. So it's what we should be, if we're looking at these measures, surely we're going to have to look at these measures on a region by region basis. Toronto, the GTA, has a relatively low number because look at that. We've got 90% of the people vaccinated in the area.
Yeah, no, I think future lockdowns, if it happens, I'm hoping not, but if it happens, it'll absolutely be on a region by region basis. We already did kind of see a little of that starting to happen in Sudbury because the public health unit over there started to bring back some restrictions when their cases were going up. And I think, yeah, you're right. A lot of people were a bit surprised because for most of this pandemic, we were used to seeing the highest cases being in Toronto and the GTA especially, and now that's not so much the case. So I think, if there is going to be a future lockdown, and that does kind of seem to be inevitable when we're looking at other jurisdictions over in Europe and even now in Portugal, which was boasting really high vaccination numbers, having to lock back down a bit. And with the holidays coming up, I think it will be interesting to see how that plays out for the Ford government politically, because people seem to be pretty A-okay with how things are going when we've had these restrictions. Pretty much everything feels open to me now, but as you said, the average 7-day rolling average for cases is getting higher. The holidays are coming up. We'll see how the kid vaccinations are going. The health minister said a third of cases COVID cases are now in kids. So obviously that vaccination rollout is going to be a huge deal. So it feels like a bit of a touch and go situation right now, but I'm hopeful. I think everyone is, that we don't have to shut back down too harshly. I don't know if people will stand for that, because it kind of seems now like we're shutting down for the anti-vaxxers, the people who aren't getting vaccinated. I don't know if the public is willing to do that so much anymore, but clearly the polls are saying, if it warrants it, it's gonna have to happen.
I think it also, like when you see 53%, I think it is, say that if we get to 1,000 cases or more, then that's the time we should be looking at putting in restrictions. It's about a third of the public right now that says, let's do it now. But they tend to be older. They tend to be people who are probably more vulnerable. But it goes back to the discussions we had last year, and that is, what is the nature of the metric that we're going to use to make these decisions? Is it simply the cascading amounts of how many people are getting it? Well, just because you get it doesn't mean that there's an impact on society. There's lots of unvaccinated people who are ending up in ICUs. Is that what we start to measure now? And that is the de facto denial of service if healthcare is removed from your abilities to get, the backlog done and all of that sort of stuff. So the question is, what is the metric that we use to make those impositions? And there's a space. I don't know whether or not governments deliberately fudge exactly when they should do this, because they want to have that flexibility of, keeping the public, off of a hard situation, like a hard number on how many are in the ICU, and then you go to it. Like, I don't know. But it seems to me that the next polling number that caught my eye was the one where you have a majority of people saying that they would, accept doctors and nurses who don't want to be vaccinated within the healthcare system, as long as it's cleaning up the backlog. And again, it's an age issue. You see those people who are younger who are more likely to want that, as opposed to the older people. And you're going to get 40-odd% who say, no, I want them all vaccinated. Those are the people who may be relying upon getting that backlog dealt with, right? Like they're the ones that may be going into the hospital. So it just seems to me, having said all of that stuff, it's a little murky nowadays on what the trigger point is. And the public itself right now, from the polling that I'm seeing, is not oriented towards one or the other thing. It's spread out like peanut butter on toast. You're not exactly sure, what point is the trigger point. So I don't know whether or not it's open for debate, whether or not governments want to make that a more precise circumstance, or whether they want to leave it a little more loosey-goosey so they have more decision-making power. But right now, the public doesn't know primarily when and on what basis we should be pulling the trigger to roll things back or put new things in place.
Well, listen, we'll one of the things I think we'll want to watch, and we'll talk about it next week, but this is Thanksgiving weekend in the U.S., big travel weekend, and we know that vaccination rates aren't as high in some parts of the U.S. as they are certainly here in Canada and in Ontario. And to Sabrina's point, this is really the starter gun has gone off in terms of large family gatherings. So maybe 2 weeks from now, watching the U.S. numbers and see how that plays out might well inform as well in terms of how we behave here. Because how often have we heard governments say, well, look what's going on over in Europe, so we're going to have to do this, that, and the other thing to prevent from it. So anyway, we'll leave it at that. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. This is On the Ledge. I'm Dave Trafford, along with Keith Leslie, John Wright, and Sabrina Nanji from the Queen's Park Observer. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast, an Eye Contact production.